I'm pleased this evening to introduce Bill Roberts and Corbett Roberts. Bill's the co-founder of Actoris, which serves clients in over 22 states. He serves privately held businesses, family businesses, and family ranches and farms. Bill's a member of the Aspen Family Group, which is a premier international group that helps family businesses all over the world. The Aspen family business has over a century of combined years of experience in helping families. With his fellow members, Bill has written a book or co-authored a book, The Keys to Family Business Success. Bill, as we're going to find out more about, works with his son Corbett, which has provided him with, as he says, an up-close and personal experience with the issues and conflicts that affect the family business. Corbett is a graduate of Baylor University, where he received his bachelor's degree in marketing, risk management, and insurance. From this, I would infer that he had a plan with regard to his future employment. And that plan may extend further than the employment, as we'll find out. In addition to his certifications as a certified financial planner, a certified life underwriter, and a chartered finance advisor, he has exhibited his interest in family businesses by being certified in family business advertising. He joined his father in 2008 in advising closely held and family businesses. Incidentally, he does own and has a connection with Albuquerque in that he owns part of a business in Albuquerque. I know I'm anxious, and I'm sure you are, to hear their respective perceptions with regard to the succession planning in a family business. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here.
Thank you, Jim. I want to turn your mic on. Thank you, Jim, for the introduction. And Corbett and I always look forward to an opportunity to be in front of family business owners and advisors. I've worked with Jim over the years and have always admired his thoughtful and careful planning and his thinking. And Jim, we really appreciate the opportunity to be here. We were doing some thinking about our connections to New Mexico, and we have clients that go back to the 1980s that we've been working with, and consequently we've met a lot of advisors, some of whom are in the room tonight. But as we were talking in the office, I found out that one of our valued team members' family on his mother's side moved to New Mexico from Spain in 1598. And they owned a great deal of the land around Raton Pass in Las Vegas. And originally had one of the 10 original stores on the plaza on Santa Fe. So we thought, boy, that probably beats anybody in the room. Anyway, so we have had an opportunity to work with New Mexico Farm Credit. We've given some talks on business succession planning around the state, and we really have enjoyed meeting the advisors here. I think the state is blessed with wonderful talent and skills in sophisticated planning with family businesses that not everyone gets to share, and we appreciate that. Corbett and I gave a lot of thought to how we might try to present golden nuggets over 50 years, most of which are mine, not his, by the way. And we had to think a lot about how we might present that wouldn't be boring or put you to sleep. And so we decided to put it into a case story. It's an actual case that's going on right now. It's a case that I started 20 years ago and that now Corbett is very much involved in. And the reason we picked this particular story is because it involved not only the succession, third generation succession, which is now going on inside the family, as you'll hear, but also involved issues around advisor succession, which also brings our story into play. So this is not just a story about consultative work that we've done. it's also very personal because it's about lessons that we've learned. And we want to pass those along. Malcolm Gladwell wrote the book, The Tipping Point. And he describes a tipping point as the thing that makes a material or big difference. And we're going to talk about tipping point events that in this family, had they made different decisions, or had they had different values or different approaches to things, this might be quite a different story that we might tell tonight. And so by sharing those, we hope that these are things that advisors can take to their clients, or that if you're in a family business, that you might take away and use at some point. We also are going to ask for some audience participation at the end, so please don't leave early. We want you to participate. So let's meet the family. We've done it in a genogram. So first we have Victor and Brenda, and by the way, you have this in your handout, so if you would like, you can make notes on this. Victor was the founder of a business. This is a business, a building material distribution business in Los Angeles. It was located in northern Orange County. And Victor had established the business with a partner and his son, Frank, 2 sisters. Frank was now coming along as the owner of the business, second generation. Frank and his wife, Doris, had Marty and his wife, Cindy, but Marty's sister and Mary and Jack were the 4 children that were involved under Frank. All of the ages you see are the current ages. So do a little math, subtract 20 years, and think about the ages. There's Victor at 66, right at a point of change in his life when he decided that it was time to slow down or retire. And he had, in fact, gifted 55 or transferred 55% of this business to Frank. Frank was 64. Marty was then 19. His 2 sisters and brothers were much younger, had not yet decided whether they were going to come into the family business or not. So this business is a very volatile business for those of you that know anything about building distribution. The margins on that business are very slim. They were doing about $50 million when we met them. They've grown that business now to over $300 million. But it's very volatile. It's totally dependent on the construction business. And as home builders are going up and down, as we've seen in the last 10 years, their profit and loss can be affected dramatically. So as our story opens here, I met Frank on a reference from a consultant that was already working with him. And we met at a Village Inn along the 405 freeway. And I've been along that same intersection many times, and I can remember that meeting like it was yesterday. And it was a meeting much like probably all of you have had at some point, where a consultant is talking to a business owner and they're trying to feel each other out. Can we work together? You know, do we think alike? What are our values? But it was pretty clear to me fairly quickly and early on that Frank had an agenda. And he was really trying to find whether we were going to be a fit for this particular agenda. And what caused that was the fact that after his father had transferred this 55% of the business to him, 5 of their key team managers and 2 of their salesmen had walked in the same day and submitted a letter of resignation and started a competing business with the avowed purpose of putting them out of business. So they had survived that. It was a tough go, but they had survived it. They'd finally gotten it back to a profitable year. But he spoke with as much passion as he could that he would never, ever be held hostage by employees like that again. So the question he asked me was, is there a way for us to design a plan that would be hefty enough, rich enough, if you would, that would never allow those managers, or would make the managers want to stay, so that he would never have that sort of an uprising again. So we talked and worked on a design over a period of time, and finally came up with a design that would provide those managers that he had now brought on about a plan that would give them 50% of their final average compensation at retirement, and would allow them to also defer their own bonuses or compensation to construct a plan that would give them another 25%. So he felt that if he could get a plan in place that would provide 75% of their compensation, they probably weren't going to walk away. So the last piece of that puzzle was, he said, I don't want them to leave and take anything away either. So we put in a vesting schedule that said there was no vesting for 10 years, and then it would vest 10% per year to age 65. If there were employees, and there were two who were older than 45, that at age 65 they would fully vest. And so that plan was put in place, and he funded it every year. And we have talked to those employees every single year and reported that plan and the results of the plan and how it was working. He hasn't lost a single employee that he didn't want to lose. Because there are always some. We all know that. But he hasn't lost a single one. And we are now about to write the first check to the First Lady who is going to retire. She's retiring, and we're writing the first check this month. Now, that's all well and good, but so what? What this has provided for him was something that he had set forth as one of the goals when we were sitting in that Village Inn. He said, I want to provide a way and a plan so that the older managers will mentor my son's managers when he comes into the business. So he was already thinking 20 years out. And that's exactly what's happened. These older managers are now mentoring the next generation. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that they provided a very stable platform inside that business. I've watched that management team work together, and it's amazing how good they are together. They cover each other. They cover strength. They cover their weaknesses. It's worked very well. The third thing it's done is provide them the ability and the confidence to move forward with a succession plan that they really wanted to get to. And that opens Act 2 of our little story here. The planning team, and I didn't talk about them, was made up of Walt, the attorney, who had worked with the family long before I ever appeared on the scene. In fact, he had helped dismantle the partnership that when Victor bought him out. Ken, who had also been with this family for 25 years by the time I appeared on the scene. And then as we'll tell the story about their succession, we'll bring into the other players there. But having this secure and stable, these happen to be very intelligent management team, allowed them to move forward with a succession plan. As we sat as the planning team, probably like others in the room, we began to think about what are the issues that Victor, who is now well into his 60s and now early 70s, what are the issues that he's facing from an estate planning standpoint? Victor had amassed about a $15 million estate at a time when there was only a $1 million exemption, so he was faced with a $5 or $6 million estate tax. But we were concerned that the 45% that was left in his estate with the growth plans that Frank had for the business, the value of that 45% was going to explode. And we did not want that to explode in his estate. So the accountant was pretty bright. He said, I think we could get a valuation that would be probably well under what you might imagine, and we might be able to transfer that 45% to Frank and freeze the value in Victor's estate. And that's exactly what we did. We actually found 2 bad years of earnings. They used a weighted average formula for valuation, and sure enough, we got a valuation of under $1 million for that 45%. Last year, they sold one division for $20 million. So they have saved an enormous amount in estate taxes. The estate planner, the attorney who is really bright and also very aggressive, added a little twist to it. We sold it under an installment sale, And he added what is known as a self-canceling feature. And so that if Victor passed away, the note disappeared out of his estate and Frank didn't have to pay it off. So he added a little twist to it that actually worked, has not worked well because Victor hasn't passed away, but we did get it down out of his estate. The second issue we had was that Victor had accumulated about a $3 million pension plan. And I can remember meeting after meeting where the attorney and the CPA would pound on Victor and say, Victor, please use the money inside that plan. And he was so conservative. I mean, he wouldn't spend a nickel until the buffalo squeaked. And so finally we got him to consider taking his required minimum distributions, which he now was having to take, and we used those distributions to purchase a life insurance policy that would cover the estate taxes that were currently due. So we were able to then form a platform that allowed the family to move on without worrying about whether the estate tax was going to destroy what they were putting in place. The real genius that I saw there was not all the planning that was going on. It was when I packed my bags up at the end of these meetings and I would walk by Victor and Frank's office, and inevitably Frank was inside talking to Victor, and they were having this conversation, and it happened over and over and over again. And here was Victor, who had founded the business, had a strong personality, but he stepped back, and he was willing to do that, and he was the wise advisor, but not the controller. And I admired the communication level that those two had, and I learned a lot from that, from that picture that I kept seeing over and over again as we worked with them through the years. There's a fellow by the name of Roy Williams who's written a book called Preparing the Heirs, and in it he talks about a survey of over 3,200 families of 20 million or greater. And the question that was asked in the survey was, did you successfully pass assets from one generation to the next? And the results were not very good. 70% of them admitted to failure. The interesting part of that was that 65% of the failures said the reason we failed was because we weren't communicating enough to keep the levels of trust going. Joe Paul, my partner in Aspen Family Business Group, says the bandwidth of trust is proportional to the level of communication. And watching these two talk was just like teaching me that this is true. A lot of people toss the word trust around, and we don't always think about, I think we're sort of intuitive. We either trust somebody or we don't. It's sort of gut feel. But there's a book by David Maslow who it's called The Trusted Advisor, and in it he defines trust in a way that you might think would be helpful, because he says trust is equal to C plus R plus I over SO. And that is, trust equals credibility. Am I competent? Can I do what I say I can do? So can I be trusted to do it? R is reliability. It's the things that we all learn. Do what you say you're going to do, when you say you're going to do it, and do it to the level you say you're going to do it. You trust people who do that. I is a little more subtle. It's intimacy. Are we willing to be transparent? Are we willing to be open? Can we share a little bit of who we are and be real? And it's all divided by SO, which is self-orientation. All of us probably know people who are all about themselves. It's all about me. If you start a conversation with them, immediately it turns to a conversation about them. How do we trust people like that? So this is just an interesting formula that you might think about as you think about trust. So it was now time to begin to think about the planning for Frank as he began to build this business. And Corbett's going to carry that part of the story.
Sure. One thing is Bill and I looked at this talk and all the different nuggets that were available. At one point we had 50, and I promise we're not going to have 50 nuggets tonight. but we wanted to narrow it down to a few different nuggets that we felt like were important, especially in this case study and in our own story, that I think we can all glean upon and look at and say, golly, do we have this in our own business? And is this something that we should consider moving on? This family specifically had a strong sense of values. We all walk around with different values, different priorities that we have. Whether we can articulate these values or not is something that we often help families with. Specifically, this family, Frank and Marty, specifically had values that were very conservative, which is kind of a surprise in Los Angeles to some degree. But they were pretty conservative, both socially and fiscally. And they gave a lot of their assets and their time and their resources to their local church. In fact, they had a piece of land and property that they would allow the church to use for different events and different retreats and that sort of thing. So very conservative family, expressed their values and made sure their values were known within the family. Specifically within the business, they wanted their business to remain within the family. They were adamant about that from the first time Bill started meeting with them, all throughout the time, even today, that we talk about this with Marty day in and day out. So they had a strong sense of values. And the reason why we think that is important is because there's inevitably speed bumps along the way, especially in succession planning. We all know there are in life. And those values can create the why behind what we're doing. We can go back as advisors to the group and to the family and remind them the different values that they possess and why that is moving us forward through these difficult times and difficult discussions. The next nugget that we have is, you mind clicking that? The family expressed, and Frank specifically expressed, loyalty to the advisor team. We mentioned Walt earlier and Ken, and then Bill was brought into the advisor team in 95. And specifically, this allowed the advisor team to, first of all, form as a team. That nobody out there that I've ever run across has a monopoly on all the good ideas. And so for the advisor team to sit and listen to each other, and if Bill had an idea, Ken and Walt could look at that from their angle and see how does that affect the family and have communication about that in front of the family. And the family would communicate back. But this loyalty to the advisors, I think, was critical to the next couple steps that we'll talk about here in a minute, that allowed the family and the advisor team to go to the family and take some risk along the way. Specifically, we saw Marty coming along. He graduated UCLA and had some strong business acumen. Seemed like he could really take the business to the next level, which everybody was excited about. The other three siblings of Marty's, so in the third generation, did not express any interest in the business at this point. And to this day, the youngest of the third generation is 28, and none of the three others besides Marty are in the business. So it allowed our advisor community to take a look at this situation and go to Frank and say, you know what, we think this may be an opportune time to consider succession down to Marty. And Frank, to his credit, said, okay, let's look at this, let's consider this, and see if we can move forward on this. So where we started specifically with this family was helping them get clarity on these values I mentioned. Again, they had strong values, and that was very evident from the first day that we met with them and that Bill met with them. We used a questionnaire with them called the Legacy Questionnaire, and that was founded by a gentleman by the name of Scott Fithian. He worked with a professor at Boston College, and the idea behind this questionnaire was when families decide to do their planning or give to charity, what makes them move forward? And at the time, the thought process that came out of this was pretty revolutionary. I think looking back on it today, a lot of us would say in the room that it's common sense. But what the results of these studies were that when families consider moving forward with their planning or charitable giving, etc., they need clarity. And oftentimes with wealth and with family business, there's not a lot of clarity. There's a lot of complexity. So the question then becomes, well, how do we get families to have clarity on their planning and on what they want to do next? And the answer that they found was to look back on their value system. And if they can see that their value system is being perpetuated, and whatever it is they're doing, whether that be planning, giving, etc., they will tend to move forward, and that will provide some clarity. So that's where we started with this specific family. We don't start here with all families, but with this family we did. And we did the questionnaires with them. And specifically, we did the questionnaires with Frank and Doris. And what we found with the results of those questionnaires is they did have the same value structure. They wanted to pass the business within the family, but they had a serious difference of opinion of how to do that. And they actually had a couple different differences, but we're going to focus in on just one, and specifically, they had an equal versus equitable issue. Doris wanted everything to pass 1/4, 1/4, 1/4, 1/4 to her 4 children, whether they were in the business or not, which is fine. And she held this belief strongly. Frank, on the other hand, was more of an equitable type person. He was more, what was fair to him was maybe a little bit more subjective. And he felt, the way that he was raised in the business, that anybody that was going to own stock in the family business needed to not only work for the family business, but be in the management role in the family business. And that was his belief. Neither one were necessarily right or wrong, but I know that they, probably to this day, if we wouldn't have helped solve this, they would still be fighting about it to some degree. But there were 2 years worth of quarterly meetings where Bill and their CPA, Ken, brought different ideas to the family, and specifically with Doris and Frank, and asked them to consider, could we work this plan this way in such a way that both equal as well as equitable are solved? And eventually, after 2 years of meetings, quarterly meetings, they came to a resolution. And Marty, what was decided was Marty was going to buy the trusts out of the other 3 siblings that owned stock in the company, as well as the other siblings were going to receive different assets from the estate. And Doris ended up being okay with that, but it took a while for us to get there. And had we not done those questionnaires, or Bill done those questionnaires early on, I think we would have missed a planning opportunity. We probably would have gone right by it to not realize, or we would not have realized where the differences lied between the two. And I don't know about y'all, but sorry to use the word y'all, I'm from Texas. But oftentimes between husband and wife, there's differences, or business partners, siblings, especially cousins that we deal with. And that's okay. And I think it's important for a third party to be able to come in and say, that is okay. Now, how do we work through it to get to a resolution, a shared vision of where this thing is going? Frank later said in a meeting that I was a part of, that had we not dealt with this issue, this equal versus equitable issue between Doris and Frank specifically, he thinks they would have ended up having to sell the business to an outside family member, and it would not be a family business today. It was that big of a sticking point. One other note on this. Right at the time that Bill and Ken and Walt finished this plan that Doris was okay with and Frank was okay with, there was a drop in the commodity market, and they had a lot of inventory on the books that they had purchased for a high price. And so they slowly had to unload that inventory over a 2-year period with some negative results on their earnings. And what that allowed the planning team to do, Walt and Bill specifically, was to go to Frank and say, you know what, this could be an opportune time, again, to pass stock down a generation at a low valuation. And that's exactly what Frank ended up doing after some discussions. He wanted to maintain control. That was a critical component to Frank. I don't know if that's a critical component to a lot of business owners, but I think it is, especially in down times. And so what the plan was is to recharacterize the stock, voting and non-voting stock. Frank still retains 100% of the voting stock today, but Marty owns all the non-voting stock. The value of Marty's shares are somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 15 times what it was when we did that transaction. So it was a significant estate planning tool, a significant tool to move the business down to G3, which we were excited about. And Marty's in the process of now slowly buying, or he's getting ready to buy out his siblings as well as Frank's stock.
This opens up Act 3 because what we began to notice in our meetings was we had Walt, who was, he was an intense attorney. He was an attorney who had worked in a large law firm in downtown Los Angeles. He had won a major victory in a tax court case against the IRS and saved the family millions and millions of dollars, and then decided to go and practice on his own. And so he was on his own and knew this family's history he knew the documents, he knew all the things that had been done, the partnerships that had been formed to transfer to trust for Frank's sisters. He knew all of that history. And we started noticing that he wasn't as engaged in the meetings as he normally would be. Until in one meeting he announced that he was going to have to resign because he'd been diagnosed with stage 4 prostate cancer. And he needed to spend his time working on his recovery plan. Unfortunately, that recovery plan was unsuccessful and he passed away 9 months later. This was very emotional for all of us because we had become friends. We weren't just colleagues, we were friends. We respected his mind, we respected his ability. But the reality of the situation was that the Achilles heel was he was a sole proprietor with no succession plan in his practice. And now we had to find another attorney because we had problems that we still were trying to solve and work on, and we needed to get moving on those. It took a year to find the attorney, interviewing, finding the right people, making the connections, doing the interviewing. And then it took about 6 to 8 months for that attorney to get all of the documents and to begin to absorb those documents and understand all of that background that we had right at our fingertips. And the lesson there is that you got to know what your team's succession plan is, and the advisors need to have succession plans. Well, this caught my attention too, because if you notice graying hair, so I'd been thinking about my own transition plan. Corbett, as you know now, is in the business, but I got a phone call from him. He said, "Do you know anything about Northwestern Mutual's internship program?" Which I knew absolutely nothing about. And so he decided to come into the business, but he wasn't going to come into my business. Because at least for me and for us, it was better for him to go someplace else and learn the business rather than to come in and learn it underneath me. And there were several reasons, but I'll give you two. One, I had to find out, as did he, whether he liked doing what we do. Because not everybody likes doing what we do. And was he any good at it? Secondly, I wanted to give him the choice to come into the business rather than it be my choice or my demand. It has to be his dream, not mine. And that was probably the most critical component of that decision. And we thought a lot about it. He had certainly had concerns about coming into the business. We had issues and thoughts about, in fact, I just had a meeting with 4 other business owners that are in the same line of work that I'm in, all have children in the business. And we were talking over a couple of glasses of wine, and I said, "What were your biggest fears when you brought your children into the business?" And all of us admitted that one of our first fears was, what's the effect going to be if they're not, either they don't like it or they aren't competent, and now we have to make a decision, they have to leave. And how's that going to affect our relationship as father-son? So there were some fears that we were going through. Dean Fowler gives a talk, he's a Boulder family business consultant, on successful practices, 7 best practices of successful successors. It's a marvelous talk. Before he ever gets to the 7 best practices, he says if you don't have competence, you don't have a succession plan. You've got to figure out another way. You have to have competence. So both Corbett and I shared some of those fears with each other, and yet we were able to get by that, and we were able to begin to move forward. And you might talk about some of your fears along those lines.
Sure. As Bill said, competence is critical anytime you're going to have a succession plan, and if you don't have competence, you don't have a plan. And for us specifically, we had to develop what competence looked like. It all depends upon the role that individual is going to play. The competence level for CEO versus a CFO is going to be completely different. For us specifically, I was a junior at Baylor in 1999. I was a history major at the time, and I was trying to convince Bill that I needed to change majors to business, and that this was a good idea for him and for me eventually. And his response was pretty quiet. He ended up dictating a letter to me that I received at my apartment a couple of weeks later. And in that letter, we'll talk more about this here in a few minutes, he set up what was going to be eventually our succession plan. And the idea there was, you know what, Corbett, I believe that you could do this. However, you're not going to do this here right now. We're not built for you. And for us, that was true. He then went on to say, or his assistant said, I'm not sure, that there were 12 requirements that I had to meet before I was able to join the firm. And a lot of those had to do around competence, that the type of clients that we advise today, you could not just walk out of Baylor and be able to do. And so a lot of those were educational, on-the-job training sort of things. And so that focused me as to if I was going to do this, what was required of me, and I had to prove the competency level to go and do those things. And that's what we did.
And the reason that we did that was I have a partner, Leslie Dashew, who spoke here last year, and Leslie just pounds on the fact that you've got to have boundaries, you've got to have guidelines when you're bringing somebody in. And it finally got through, and I may not have handled it as well as I should have in writing the letter, but it was very important to set the expectations for him before he came into the business. We also had to learn to communicate differently, and this I think is faced by every family that goes through this. And I watched Frank and Victor do this, watched their communication and how that changed over the years. But here I had to go from being the father to a son to a father and a mentor from afar, because he's in Texas, I'm in Colorado, to now a boss who has to hold him accountable, still being the mentor, having to fulfill all of those roles. Until now, it's a more equal communication pattern, because now we're talking about business decisions going forward that are going to affect him probably for more years than for me. So often I'll ask him questions about business decisions that I'm making now, because those are really things he's got to deal with going forward into the future. So learning how to communicate differently and watching how this family did it was really something that was, they set the mark for us, and we have followed that pattern. And Corbett's had to learn to do the same thing.
I think we had to learn to communicate differently on multiple levels. And there are still times where, as Bill said earlier, he's my father. And so I will ask him, I need to have you put your dad hat on this one. We've got this issue or that issue. But he's also my boss and the owner of the company that I work in. And so I have to respect that, and we have to have conversations in that light too. When we advise families on this issue, and I pull the successors aside, I tell them that it is their responsibility mostly to change the communication pattern within the family in a positive way. They are no longer, if they are family members, they no longer can act like children in the way they communicate. Typically, we establish some rules here. You can't email after a certain time at night, or you've had certain conversations with your spouse who is telling you what he or she may think. Those types of rules that I think are critical to establish the communication that needs to be healthy enough to move the succession plan forward. I think everybody in the room knows, if you've been around succession, there's plenty of speed bumps, like I mentioned earlier. The communication pattern is critical. Another one that we often see that is detrimental to families, we really want families to be the best families they can be and the business to be the best business it can be through this process, is something called triangulation, where if I have a problem with Bill, I go to my mother and say, you know what, Mom, can you talk to Bill about this because he needs to pay me more or whatever? Usually we don't have that conversation, but that no longer can exist within the family. Now, I don't have a problem with a third party being the listening ear that sometimes we need to diffuse emotions or something like that, but it's critical to learn to communicate differently. You can no longer be the child just purely communicating as the child to the parent anymore.
as we think about this transition plan and the way that we've watched Victor and Frank and Marty, we think about it kind of in two parts. One part is the transition of our reputation, our brand, our processes, our vision for the future, our shared vision for the future, and we could spend an evening talking about just that one section. But the second piece, which is really critical and is what we have been working on with this particular client with Corbett, is the transition of the relationships that I've built over 35 years, and I want that to be as seamless as possible. And I was fortunate enough to have two clients who happened to be working with each other, so I got to see both sides of this picture. There was a metal fabricator who was selling to a manufacturer who was manufacturing products that were used to process poison gases in Johnson Island, in Pueblo, etc. The interesting part was that I knew the metal fabricator was planning to pass the business to his three sons, and he was in this process. But I was talking to the manufacturer, and he said, "Look, you know, it's really interesting to watch what they're doing." And he began to describe this sort of seamless transition that he was experiencing, and how the father was gradually stepping back and allowing the sons to be the ones who were carrying forward the processes. And I thought, that's the model that I want. And so that's exactly what we have tried to create as we are beginning to do this through all of our clients. And Victor and Frank and Marty are have been our guinea pigs, and Corbett actually is in the process of doing one of these sort of seamless transitions.
The key, I think, in any business is relationships. And so transitioning those relationships is not something you can just manufacture out of thin air. So Bill and I specifically every year sit down and review clients that he wants to pass on to me and to start building those relationships. For us, that's been a 7 to 8 year process. And I would imagine by the year 11 or 12, I will have met most of those clients and built relationships with them.
I hope so.
I hope so too. Specifically with Marty, though, you know, it takes a while to build that relationship, and that took time and energy and effort from me, as well as the ability for him to trust me. And Bill did a great diagram of that earlier. Specifically, I am working, and I am the point person on this key person plan that Frank set up all those years ago. I am now the one in charge of paying those benefits. We had 2 employees retire early, and one is now receiving the full retirement benefit at her appropriate or attained age that we were targeting. That transition of that relationship has taken 6 years, and now we're at a place where I am the point person on a lot of these things, and that's good for both Bill and Frank. It allows them to talk about other issues, and Marty and I can deal with the business issues moving forward. The next nugget is being proactively patient, or patiently proactive, however you want to phrase that, if you are a successor. And I think it's important for all the generations in the room, especially if you're in a family business, to consider the awkward role that the successor often finds themselves in. Oftentimes we hear successors talk about how they are held hostage by the lack of a plan, a succession plan, to get them ownership within a business, and there's other areas of succession that they need to consider. But they are in a unique situation. Oftentimes key employees don't really care for them for a host of different reasons, whether real or imagined, and so they have to work through those issues. But a successor needs to have a clear understanding early on in the process of what is the shared vision that I possess with the current generation in front of me. What is the vision that we possess to move the succession plan along? And then agree upon that vision as well as the timeline. And oftentimes we will see a senior generation maybe drag their feet for whatever reason. And there's no problem with that, that happens. But what is a successor's reaction to that? Are they patient? Do they approach the senior generation with humility? Do they react in a non-emotional way? These types of things are critical to the succession plan. And this is where a succession plan potentially could blow up if the next generation is not patient, but you also have to respect the fact that they do have to be proactive along the way. And that's a critical component of what we try to teach the next generation. Sometimes that takes, most of the time actually it does. And sometimes it doesn't. We have to work on the damage in the relationships that sometimes causes.
And Corbett is very good at nudging me along. And I think that this is one of those tipping point issues in a family that if done correctly, it can work very well. If done without some aplomb and without some thought, it can not turn out so well. And Corbett has handled it well for us. On August 12th, we have a meeting with this family and the planning team in Los Angeles. And so we're going through the email circulation now, putting together the agenda. And it's really interesting to think about what we're going to talk about, because we've got about 5 or 6 of the agenda items already formulated. The first one on the list is Frank's new role as the chairman of the board, not the CEO, and Marty's role now as CEO president. We're also going to talk about Victor and Brenda's deteriorating medical conditions. And this is hard to talk about because Victor's become somebody I admire and become a friend. And Victor was driving around the city of Los Angeles for 8 hours without anybody knowing where he was. And he's lost a lot of his memory. So what are the issues that are still buried in his estate that we need to think about, because now we know it's only a matter of time until we're going to have to deal with those issues. So that's on the agenda. Marty's new role, and when is Frank going to transfer the controlling interest in the company, and how is that going to be priced, and how is it going to be paid for? Then we have Marty. Marty's got to buy stock from his siblings who are not going to participate in the business. So we've got some big items to think about. We have a new management team that's coming along that's going to now participate in this plan that's been in place since '96. If you think back, 20 years ago, we were talking about some of these very same issues. And here this family has consistently applied their values. They've consistently continued to plan. They have consistently done the things that were necessary so that we can be having this conversation about the transition to G3. And we're even thinking now into G4 because Marty's got plans to grow the business. What are the issues that we need to think about there? Do we need to begin to think about pushing some of Marty's stock down to the next generation? This family has just done an absolutely marvelous job of handling those role changes and responsibility changes in a way that's just been an excellent example for us to follow. And we've tried to learn from that and transfer some of that to others. One of the issues that came along as all of this was developing was having a compensation agreement or developing a compensation agreement for family members. And I can remember having conversations with Frank along the way, and he was very clear about what he would and would not do in terms of compensation for his son. And one of the things he would not do was compensate him based on his last name. He compensated him based on what he did and how well he performed, and bonused him based on that. As opposed to another manufacturing firm that we walked into that had 8 family members from 3 different brothers, 5 of whom were in the business and 3 who were not. And unfortunately, 2 of them had less competency than the others and less interest in the business, and consequently weren't contributing as much, but they were being compensated equally. And it was a dogfight. And it took us 2 years to convince them that they had to develop a compensation policy that was consistent with guidelines, and it was a fight to the end until finally one brother capitulated. But they finally have now instituted a compensation plan, and in fact, I just talked to one of the the compensation experts who worked with him designing it, and he said, I think we finally got it. We finally got the pieces in place. Not having this nailed down can be a real disaster in a family business, and it can be one of those tipping points that causes all kinds of conflict and chaos. We've had dozens of discussions about compensation. How do we compensate? How do we bring him along? And how do we bring others along as we bring other advisors into our business? So we're working on the same issues. They're sort of a little different, but we've got to develop the same thing that these families do. And it's all about having guidelines and setting boundaries before the issue becomes the issue. You want to talk about that?
Sure. The last few nuggets I think are critical and just kind of tie a bow around a lot of the things that we were talking about. It is critical, and Walt and now Marvin, the new attorney, have reminded us of this, that if we do a succession plan, it doesn't really matter if it's not coordinated into the family's estate plan, which I think a lot of people in the room would assume, but you would be surprised how many times we see a succession plan and then you read the wills and trusts and they say something completely different. And that is a challenge. So we need to make sure that all of those items are on the same page. And specifically, we're addressing who will do what role are they going to play, who's going to get what, and who is responsible for what. In addition to that, how is that being communicated to the next generation? Do they know what they're responsible for? Do they know what their role is supposed to be? If they don't, there's some communication that needs to occur there, and I think that's critical. And Marty and Frank have done an excellent job, and we're continuing to stay on them about making sure that their wills and trusts reflect the succession plan. One thing that we often talk about, and you heard Bill talk about this earlier, is the estate tax. And does the estate tax play into this? This family's legacy, one of this family's values is to have the family business remain in the family. Most of the family businesses that we consult with and talk to have the same desire. There's obviously external forces that are going against that every day, one of which is the estate tax. And I'm often surprised how many successful owners don't have a full grasp of the estate tax. One, because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but that's for a different discussion for a different day. So currently, you can pass down $11 million, almost $11 million, if you're married and have the proper wills and marital trust in place to the next generation with no estate tax. And that number is moving up a little bit each and every year. And there's some state estate taxes around, but for the most part, let's use the 11 million number. Anything over that is going to be taxed at about 40%. So that's what we're seeing. So 40 cents on every dollar above that number. So it's important, and by the way, the IRS is not interested in running your family business. They're not interested usually in real estate. They typically want cash, and they want cash within a certain amount of time after the assets pass down a generation. There's some other ways to deal with the estate tax. You can have an installment note essentially to the IRS, and there's a few other ways. But with Marty and this family specifically, they wanted to address this through insurance, and so that's what we completed with Marty. Even though he's only 39, his projected estate tax is pretty significant, and he wanted to make sure that the family legacy and the family value of keeping the family in the family business in the family maintained no matter what happened, and he was not going to have the estate tax take that away. And so that's how we addressed that issue. Again, as I said earlier, there are other ways to deal with it as well, but it's something to consider for every family business we work with.
We have learned in working with the Family Business Family Firm Institute and with the Aspen Family Business Group that there's 7 components to the transfer of a family business. And we use this as kind of a checklist to see how we're doing with a family. And it's kind of interesting, and it might be something that you could use if you're in a family business or as advisors to family businesses. You might use this as a checklist to see how your families are doing. So in thinking about the Smith family, they had transferred ownership from Victor down to Frank and then on to Marty. So they had figured this out in a way that was consistent with their values. And so they had transferred ownership, and they had done it without problems around control. Frank has been able to keep control because he owns all the controlling stock to this day, but he's going to transfer that one of these days, probably not in the too distant future. And so eventually all of the control and all of the ownership will have transferred now to the next generation in a very efficient manner. So they've done a pretty good job of that. So what about values?
Yeah, oftentimes when families engage us, they want to talk about that top line and that top line only. How do we transfer ownership down a generation? And usually there's an event that's got some urgency behind it, is when they engage us. If we had our druthers, we'd love to have a 10-year runway with these families because we want to address these other issues. These other 6, really, I think if we can complete all of these with different families, we've done a good job of succession, and our likelihood of success within that family truly passing that business down a generation will be a lot higher. The area of values, how do we pass on values down a generation? I think that's a struggle for every parent. What does that look like? And I think the key component there is to listen to the next generation and make sure that they are taking on your values. And if they're not, why or why not? And let's get to the bottom of that. And that's something that Marty and Frank have done a good job. When Marty came in from UCLA, he was not the best listener. He was rough around the edges, both to the advisor team and to Frank. But he's changed now. He's become a better listener, and he's done a better job heeding his father's wisdom, and specifically within the area of passing those values down. That's something that he's done.
They've done a good job also of passing relationships. They have consistently kept their planning team intact. They've been loyal to their advisors. I'm amazed at the relationship that they have within the family and how well they've kept that together. You know, we've got sisters that are not involved in the business of Frank. They never try to get involved with the business. So somewhere in their DNA, they have done just an excellent job of maintaining those relationships and understanding that the relationships are more important than maybe just financial issues. So they've done a very good job of that. He's also done a good job of passing authority down. Victor did a great job of passing that along to Frank and not stepping in his way. And we saw that model over and over again. And that's led also to a passage of knowledge.
There's a great book out there called Deep Knowledge, and it's how do you transfer knowledge down a generation. And one of the conclusions of the book is it takes about 10 years to pass knowledge down. And things that Bill does instinctively, and has been doing instinctively for just a few years, I am just now starting to pick up on in year 7. But it takes about 10 years to pass that knowledge down a generation, is what we have found. And specifically within this company, there were key pieces of knowledge that the management team had that Frank wanted to make sure were in place so Marty could receive that knowledge when he came on board. And Bill mentioned that earlier. So they've done a really good job of transferring knowledge. Along with that is transferring management. How does the next generation lead? It's usually a lot different in management style and that sort of thing than the senior generation. So what does that look like? What kind of skills are the next generation taking on that will make sure that that company's key management team wants to stay on board, which in this case they have.
I'm pleased this evening to introduce Bill Roberts and Corbett Roberts. Bill's the co-founder of Actorus, which serves clients in over 22 states. He serves privately held businesses, family businesses, and family ranches and farms. Bill's a member of the Aspen Family Group, which is a premier international group that helps family businesses all over the world. The Aspen family business has over a century of combined years of experience in helping families. With his fellow members, Bill has written a book or co-authored a book, The Keys to Family Business Success. Bill, as we're going to find out more about, works with his son Corbett which has provided him with, as he says, an up-close and personal experience with the issues and conflicts that affect the family business. Corbett is a graduate of Baylor University, where he received his bachelor's degree in marketing, risk management, and insurance. From this, I would infer that he had a plan with regard to his future employment. And that plan may extend further than the employment, as we'll find out. In addition to his certifications as a certified financial planner, a certified life underwriter, and a chartered finance advisor, he has exhibited his interest in family businesses by being certified in family business advertising. He joined his father in 2008 in advising closely held and family businesses. And incidentally, he does own and has a connection with Albuquerque, in that he owns part of a business in Albuquerque. I know I'm anxious, and I'm sure you are, to hear their respective perceptions with regard to the succession planning in a family business. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here.
Thank you, Jim.
You want to turn your mic on?
Thank you, Jim, for the introduction. And Corbett and I always look forward to an opportunity to be in front of family business owners and advisors. I've worked with Jim over the years and have always admired his thoughtful and careful planning and his thinking. And Jim, we really appreciate the opportunity to be here. We were doing some thinking about our connections to New Mexico, and we have clients that go back to the 1980s that we've been working with, and consequently we've met a lot of advisors, some of whom are in the room tonight. But as we were talking in the office, I found out that one of our valued team members' family on his mother's side moved to New Mexico from Spain in 1598. And they owned a great deal of the land around Raton Pass in Las Vegas. And originally had one of the 10 original stores on the plaza on Santa Fe. So we thought, boy, that probably beats anybody in the room. So, anyway, so we have had an opportunity to work with New Mexico Farm Credit. We've given some talks on business succession planning around the state, and we really have enjoyed meeting the advisors here. I think the state is blessed with wonderful talent and skills in sophisticated planning with family businesses that not everyone gets to share, and we appreciate that. Corbett and I gave a lot of thought to how we might try to present golden nuggets over 50 years, most of which are mine, not his, by the way. And we had to think a lot about how we might present that wouldn't be boring or put you to sleep. And so we decided to put it into a case story. It's an actual case that's going on right now. It's a case that I started 20 years ago and that now Corbett is very much involved in. And the reason we picked this particular story is because it involved not only the succession, third generation succession, which is now going on inside the family, as you'll hear, but also involved issues around advisor succession, which also brings our story into play. So this is not just a story about consultative work that we've done, it's also very personal because it's about lessons that we've learned. And we want to pass those along. Malcolm Gladwell wrote the book, The Tipping Point. And he describes a tipping point as the thing that makes a material or big difference. And we're going to talk about tipping point events that in this family, had they made different decisions, or had they had different values or different approaches to things, this might be quite a different story that we might tell tonight. And so by sharing those, we hope that these are things that advisors can take to their clients, or that if you're in a family business, that you might take away and use at some point. We also are going to ask for some audience participation at the end, so please don't leave early. We want you to participate. So let's meet the family. We've done it in a genogram. So first we have Victor and Brenda, and by the way, you have this in your handout, so if you would like, you can make notes on this. Victor was the founder of a business. This is a business, a building material distribution business in Los Angeles. It was located in northern Orange County. And Victor had established the business with a partner and his son Frank, 2 sisters. Frank was now coming along as the owner of the business, second generation. Frank and his wife Doris had Marty and his wife Cindy, but Marty's sister and Mary and Jack were the 4 children that were involved under Frank. All of the ages you see are the current ages. So do a little math, subtract 20 years, and think about the ages. There's Victor at 66, right at a point of change in his life when he decided that it was time to slow down or retire, and he had, in fact, gifted 55 or transferred 55% of this business to Frank. Frank was 64. Marty was then 19. His 2 sisters and brothers were much younger, had not yet decided whether they were going to come into the family business or not. So this business is a very